Good morning. We're going to get started, so if you can take your seats, we'll get the show started. Good morning. Good morning, and a special thank you to the people sitting in the front row. I appreciate the company. So good morning and welcome to the Spring 2007 Professional Development Activities Day. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Michelle Poggi, coordinator of the Resource Center, and I'm very happy to be here today. Before we continue, I'd like to ask that all cell phones, pagers, and any of those other noisy electronic devices be silenced or turned off, please. Thanks. Next, I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome our president, Dr. Agrella. Thank you for being here today. I'd also like to send a special hello and welcome to all of our colleagues at the Petaluma campus. The Petaluma campus is having a full day of professional development activities, and we are teleconferencing this morning's sessions to Petaluma. Let's give our colleagues there a welcoming round of applause. Hello, Petaluma. Additionally, a welcome and thanks to all of the classified staff, administrators, and management team members who have been here preparing the way for a smooth start to the spring semester. Welcome to you, and welcome back to all of our faculty colleagues here in Santa Rosa, at the Petaluma campus, the Public Safety Training Center, and the Schoen Farm. Now for a couple of housekeeping items. After this morning's lecture, we will adjourn for a 25-minute break in the lobby. I do hope you enjoy the light fare that's been prepared for you from High Feather. At the end of the break, please return to this room for the general session on the Flex program. There are also a couple of changes to announce on the pink sheet, the program that was handed out to you in the lobby. Please note that the Session 1 workshop, The Gathering of Assessors, and the Session 2 workshop, Outcomes Are the Objective, will now both take place in room 1588, Emeritus Hall. Also, the 2 sessions of the workshop, Learning Communities, are canceled, unfortunately. This workshop will be offered on a couple of dates through the Resource Center menu of activities later this semester. And now, without further delay, on to the program. We have a well-planned day ahead for you. We are about to hear the annual faculty lecture, a longtime SRJC tradition named in honor of Brooke Tauzer. A special committee of past Tauzer lecturers meets annually to select the next person to receive this honor. To introduce this year's lecturer, please join me in welcoming to the Burbank Auditorium stage last year's honored speaker from the Petaluma campus and the Department of Communication Studies, Mary Pierce.
Good morning. It is a privilege and a delight to introduce this year's Tauzer lecturer. Though I only have a couple of minutes, I'm going to try to address this complex question. Who is Scott Fuller? For this task, I asked some of Scott's friends, family, and colleagues, how would they tackle this question? This is what political science instructor Monty Freydig had to say. To paraphrase Churchill, I cannot forecast the actions of Fuller. He is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. I gave up trying to discover who is Scott Fuller long ago. The question I usually have is, where is Scott Fuller? And do you know how to reach him? Well, Monty, it turns out that Scott is a traveler. Here he is getting an early start in Egypt with his mother. Raised in a military family, Scott grew up traveling throughout the United States, Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. And here are a few more pictures of Scott on his travels. Kathleen Kramer from our Disability Resources Department says that Scott is a man in love with the world and all of its possibilities, mysteries, insanities, essential truths, and essential beauties. His interests are as diverse as ancient Buddhism, social and political activism, fine wine, the 49ers, evolution, opera, and the tidal patterns of San Francisco Bay. Scott is a devoted dad. Here he is with daughter Ruth, son Josh, and Josh's partner Caroline. Ruth says, "As I grow older, I become increasingly aware of my father's influence on me. My father taught me to appreciate the complexity of human beings and the importance of a full and meaningful life. As I approach my mid-30s, I am finding that my inability to tolerate bullshit is linked directly to my paternal DNA." Scott is an activist. A psychology student at San Francisco State in the 1960s, Scott participated in strikes in the anti-war movement. Here he is in the 1980s protesting nuclear proliferation with folks from a Russian sister city. Scott is a scholar. He completed graduate work in sociology at UC Irvine and began his career as a teacher that has spanned 35 years. He taught sociology at UC San Diego, College of Marin, and joined the SRJC Behavioral Sciences Department in 1984. He has taught for our study abroad program in London, Florence, and Paris, and here he is taking some students on a field trip in Florence. Library Dean Will Beatty says, "Scott's scholarly interests go far beyond the discipline of sociology. He is an engaged academic whose interests are as varied and as large as his heart." English instructor Bob Duxbury describes Scott as a blustery, loud, booming introvert full of facts and figures, a great teacher, a patient listener, an intrepid traveler, a trencherman of girth, a polymath, a gentleman, a scholar, and a dear friend. Scott is a sailor. His friend and sailing companion Dave Warner tells the story of Scott buying a boat to try his hand at racing, where he earned the moniker Skipper in deference to his prowess as a forceful commander of the hearty crew. And here they are after 2 days sailing down the California coast together. I'd like to leave you with a final quote from economics instructor Jack Wegman, who says, "Scott is the most intellectually honest person that I have ever worked with. He is both willing and able to leave his biases and political predispositions out of the analysis. Even more importantly, he is willing to substitute vodka in his martinis when we run out of gin." Today's presentation is entitled "The Mind's Big Bang and the Origins of Art." Please welcome our 2007 Tauzer lecturer, Scott Fuller.
I give up. It's amazing what your family and friends can do when they collude, isn't it? Beware. Okay, let me just begin with a number of thank yous. The presentation this morning was the result of a collaborative effort. Mary being one of the collaborators, and Will Beatty. My friend the Warrenders helped with this project. And then a special thanks to Kathleen Kramer, who has accompanied me on this journey. And a journey it has been. In fact, it began in Mary's living room in 2003 in Florence when Mary was teaching in the study abroad program. And I was over there researching Leonardo da Vinci. And Sean Forrester, Phil's son, was there. He lives in Florence and was studying art. And Will was there. And we ended up very spontaneously having a discussion about art and aesthetics and what made great art and what was that all about. And though I had been interested in art my entire life, these questions came with a freshness that I had never experienced. It was like being in grad school and having your eyes open for the first time. And then the quest, the journey continued last semester when I was teaching in Paris. And hey, Russ, I'm going to start now, I think. And I had the opportunity to visit the Dordogne in the southwestern part of France. And the Dordogne is famous for its caves and its cave art. So I was able to visit the caves at Rouffignac and Font de Gaume and Camberel. But most important for me was the cave of Lascaux. And though the actual cave is no longer accessible, there's been a tremendous amount of damage, much of it from people visiting from the CO2. They've created a remarkable facsimile, Lascaux 2, Lascaux Faux, the artificial cave, but it has the same effect. And as I looked at this art, I was increasingly amazed, not only at the skill, but I was amazed at my emotional response. I had this palpable, tangible feeling of another human mind that I could recognize, reaching across time. I didn't know what the message was, although I felt there was some message there. And this overwhelming sense of, oh my God, what amazing creatures we are. Lascaux was occupied roughly from 19,000 years ago to about 15,000 years ago. And yet there was an aliveness and there was a freshness in these paintings. And I started asking those questions, again, that had occurred in Mary's living room about what is art really about? Why do we do it? Where did it come from? Why do you find it in almost all human cultures? And so I developed a thesis, and that is that basically about 50,000 years ago, there was an explosion in human mental abilities. Sometimes it's called the creative explosion. Sometimes it's called the mind's Big Bang. And that in that process, 50,000 years ago, plus or minus 20,000 years, that's one of the things I had to get used to in all this was working with paleoarchaeological time. 20,000 years plus or minus, it's not a big deal. For some people it is, but not apparently for paleoarchaeologists. Anyway, I became fascinated with these questions of why art, where does it come from, why is it a human universal? So what I want to do this morning is quickly take you through looking at art as a universal, what that means, what sense we can make out of that. Then I want to share with you the approach I use to looking at art, which is an interdisciplinary approach. So I want to talk a little bit about the disciplines that I've pulled in to do this exploration. And then take you into the thesis itself about the mind's Big Bang and the biological foundations for art. And then I want to talk about how that translates into society, how what perhaps starts out biologically very quickly becomes social. And then I want to end with talking about how art transcends its own social and biological origins. So it's quite a full plate, and I'm going to have to move at a pretty quick clip. But I'm going to try to put most of this on my website, my school website, and certainly a bibliography for you. So if I end up moving too fast, you can look stuff up, and then hopefully we can have emails with each other and talk about some of this, okay? So let's start by looking at art as a human universal. One of the amazing things to me is that across time, across space, across human cultures, you find some version of art. This is a rock painting that's roughly 45,000 years old, roughly about the same time as the cave paintings in Europe, perhaps a little earlier. And it's from Australia. A Caravaggio that's in the Louvre. African carved art. Islamic art that can't use figurative representation. The sand paintings of the Southwest. The art of ancient Egypt. Buddhist iconography. The masks of the Pacific Northwest. Medieval Western art. The Chola bronze, the Nataraja of the 12th century India. And the courtly art of the ancient Maya. Hopefully many of you saw that when it was here not too long ago. In the West, we tend to look at art for art's sake, meaning that we're compelled to make art, and that art has its own justification. But one of the first things you face when you look at art in a universal fashion is that in many cultures, there's no notion of art as we understand it. For example, in the Mende of Africa, a Mende sculptor was being interviewed by an anthropologist. And the sculptor was saying, I'm not nearly the sculptor that my father was. And the anthropologist asked him why. And he says, well, I sculpt for other people. I make things for other people. My father, he made things for the gods. Or among the Inuit of the Arctic Circle, the Inuit have no word for art. They have no word for artist. In fact, for the Inuit, everyone knows how to carve. It's an everyday thing. And again, in a discussion with an anthropologist, an Inuit carver was asked, well, why then do you do these carvings? And he said simply, well, there's a proper way to do everything. So our glorified conceptions of art are not contained in many of the cultures of the world. But you and I, in fact, would recognize this as art. It may not be recognized by others as art. And we'll come back to the sticky problem that creates. Art is also a contested concept in this culture, what philosophers call a contested concept, which is, guess what? Nobody can agree upon what it is. If you want to get a good example of that, in 1997, the Royal Academy in London put on an exhibition called the Sensation Exhibition, where they took art from the Saatchi collection and of young artists. And people resigned from the board of the Royal Academy. For example, in this famous piece by Damien Hirst, what he did was he took a cow's head, let it deteriorate, flooded the thing with maggots and flies, and called it 1,000 years. Or in this piece by the Chapman brothers, based on a Goya etching, dismembered bodies in an unbelievably realistic plastic form. Or this piece, good, you're paying attention, that's a good sign. Or this piece by Sarah Lewis, I don't need to have to describe it, but one wonders the art school that she ended up attending. So anyway, you can see, is that art? Well, it's not for me to say whether it is or not. It's just very interesting that what you find is a tremendously wide variation. And maybe this rather modern piece that looks kind of like an early Jackson Pollock was created by a chimpanzee named Congo in the 1950s. That's his trainer, the ethologist Desmond Morris. 3 months ago, that piece sold for 24,000 pounds in London. So, I'm not going to even try to define art in any formal sense. It would just make me look silly and ridiculous. But I want to turn to philosopher William James, who suggested that concepts have what he called a kernel meaning. Even a contested concept, like art, has a kernel meaning. And then branching out from that are all kinds of fringe meanings that are heavily contextual, that are historical, that are interactional. And so we use terms like, medicine's not a science, it's an art. Or we say the art of loving. And somehow that makes sense to us. Perhaps even a more fruitful path would be to look at Wittgenstein's idea of family resemblances. But what I'm interested in is this idea that there's a kernel meaning that perhaps we can begin to use to talk about art across time and space. And so for me, even though I recognize there's a tremendous amount of relativity in art, a tremendous amount of relativity in standards of aesthetics, there still seems to be a human universal to transform the material culture in ways that involve an aesthetic creation of objects and images that are both interesting and underline interesting and also have symbolic meaning. So that's the definition of art that I'm going to be using, a kind of a rough and ready definition. And that's what I think you find in all human cultures. Now, to begin to explore this, I had to draw on a huge, not a huge, but for me a huge number of disciplines. And the starting place for me is with the fact that we as human beings are biological creatures. We have an evolutionary history. And that certainly with things that are human universals, we have to talk about biology. But we are also psychological creatures that have unique individual histories and unique forms of creativity. And that's in many ways perhaps even more important than our biology. And that we're also social creatures who grew up in a specific time and place in history and have specific social locations. And then finally, we're spiritual creatures. We have unique relationships to the unseen world. For some, it's about God. Who knows what it's about? But we have that special relationship. And the world of art lives in all these worlds. Okay? It transcends, if you like, all these worlds and affects all these worlds. So I'm starting with a recognition that I'm going to have to cross these different worlds or spheres that we live in as human beings. In terms of discipline, my starting place is with what is called evolutionary psychology. Because I'm assuming that art is a human universal, there should be some kind of evolutionary origins, some kind of adaptation that helped human beings survive. Now, that's not going to be true of all human behavior, but I think when you get into universals, that in fact makes some sense. Current evolutionary psychologists basically look at the human mind like a Swiss Army knife, that we developed a set of modules that were specific adaptations to environmental pressures over time. And so we have, if you like, all these different abilities put together in this one package that we call the mind. And so I kept asking myself, well, what would art be selected for? How could that, improve our survivability? And I kept going, well, maybe evolutionary psychology is not going to be of much help here. And then I was reminded by Stephen Jay Gould's critique of evolutionary psychology, where Gould says in his famous article with Richard Lewontin, Spandrels of St. Mark's in Venice, that, you know what? Not everything that human beings do, in fact, not everything that living creatures do, is selected for, okay? Some of it is just by accident. You have alleles, and they're attached to, functions that get selected for, and they come along for the ride. So I started thinking, well, was art something that just came along for the ride? And I kept going, no. Universals are not just things that go along for the ride. Maybe. He also developed a term called adaptation, where he said oftentimes what happens in evolution is that you borrow things. For example, long before there were birds, there were dinosaurs that had feathers. And birds basically accepted feathers. And that much of evolution can be seen as things developing in one context and then being borrowed in another context. So I'm going, well, maybe that's the case with art. So these are the things that are buzzing through my head, okay? The example he uses in terms of the spandrels of San Marcos is that, look at the dome. And you've got a dome that's supported by 4 arches. And where those arches come together supporting the dome, there are these triangular structures called spandrels. If you have a dome and you have arches, guess what? You naturally get spandrels. That's how it works. Were they created by the architect for any particular reason? No. They just were an artifact. So is art a spandrel? Okay. To paleoanthropology, I turn for examples, for the fossil record, for the record of tool industry and artifact. Okay, so that's where I started looking for evidence for things on this quest. For the interactions with the brain, I turned to cognitive and affective neuroscience. The 1990s were literally the age of the brain because of brain scans, and so there's been a quantum leap in terms of what we know about brain and brain function, and so I'm going to look at how that, in fact, in some ways affects art. And then from my own discipline, sociology, the role that art plays in society. And then from art history, I'm looking for universals, things that we can see perhaps across time and space in the world of art. And so what I'm trying to find is this center place where these disciplines come together. And you'll see as I go through this that I'm constantly looking for where the psychology of evolutionary history, anthropology, sociology, art history, neuroscience all connect up. Okay, now to the mind's Big Bang. And what happened? I have a stick. Oops. So I'm going to have to do some old-fashioned teaching here. I was ruminating the other day. When I first started teaching, it was chalk and talk. That was it. And that was great. Can't do that anymore. The world has changed on us. But this is a reminiscence of the chalk and talk days. Basically, in terms of the evolution of the size of the human brain, okay, this is starting about 4 million years ago. There is a tremendous amount of constancy in size. Then about 2 million years ago, you get a big jump. And then another million years ago, you get another jump. Now, if we plot tool making on this, what you begin to see is that tools come about at a time when there's no jump in brain size. So you go, well, gee, what is the relationship between the size of the brain and tool making, all right? Then we get a second jump where there's a jump in the size of the human brain, but tools don't change, and they remain relatively static for about 1.5 million years. And then finally, the period that we're going to be interested in, which is about 50,000 years ago, there's this huge jump, but it's not till the end of this jump that we get the creative explosion, the development of art, and a tremendous array of human artifact. There's about a 150,000 year period between the development of what would be recognizably anatomically modern humans, meaning this person would walk down the street and you would go, you know, you're kind of ugly, but you look like me. And the rise of what paleoanthropologists call behaviorally modern humans. So there's about a 150-year period. And generally, it's the advent of imagery, of figurative art, and pushing the dates back a little, perhaps to about 70,000, 80,000 years ago, the development of beads where human beings are engaged in adornment and putting incised patterns on things. This is, in the literature, considered perhaps to be the oldest sign, surviving sign of humans using some kind of symbolic form. No idea what it is, but there's nothing like it before. And this is a piece of red ochre that was used for decoration. Similarly with the beads, it goes back, 75 to 80,000 years ago. So there are antecedents, and also in human burials. This burial is much more recent. This is about a 30,000-year-old burial. But even though there are antecedents, when one actually starts to look at the artifacts, at the archaeological record, you are amazed at this explosion. I visited the National Prehistoric Museum in Les Aisies in the Dordogne, and they have these cases of artifacts. And you'll be walking along, and you'll be looking at the tools, and they kind of all look alike, and you realize you're walking down millions of years. And then all of a sudden, and the tools look like this, the kind of the Acheulean hand axes. They were the kind of the tool you would use for everything. And then all of a sudden, you began to see not only bone being used, and this is, roughly 50,000 years ago, you began to see bone being used, but these remarkably, gorgeously crafted, specific tools that were fine and delicate and an array beyond imagination. And you really begin to feel this explosion that came about. And not only did it come about in Northern Europe, you find very similar artifacts in South Africa and in Australia. Most of us think that when we left Africa, roughly 50,000 years ago, plus or minus 20, that all the pieces for behaviorally modern humans were in place. And that's why you find it kind of simultaneously in both Africa and in Australia. But that's a whole other lecture, and it's full of all kinds of debate. Now, the question for me then was, well, what's that creative explosion about? Why did it occur? And what were the essential elements in it? Basically, we became behaviorally modern, okay, during a period of tremendous climate change. And in fact, there perhaps has never been a period that had quite as profound fluctuations in climate as this period, basically the last ice age. And so the human beings were presented with tremendous environmental pressures. Now, the consensus of people who are looking at the evolution of the brain is that the climate change obviously did not produce brain changes, but what it did produce was tremendous selective pressure. That is to say, because of constantly having to adapt to new environments, human beings had to become very creative. Creativity was selected for. So what I want to look at now are the building blocks that this pumping effect of climate change worked on. What were the pieces that were basically being selected for? And particularly the pieces that were being selected for that would turn into art. The first is humans' ability to mimic. Now, you find mimicry in birds, you find mimicry in the primates, but complex sequential mimicry, being able to imitate long strings of things in great complexity, is unique to us. And it turns out that we're actually wired for that. For those of you who kind of read the science stuff, you'll know that in the last 10 years, one of the big revolutions in brain science has been the discovery of mirror neurons. So that when I look at you, for example, eating an ice cream bar, not only is my visual cortex and my memory centers triggered, but the very parts of my face and body that would be eating an ice cream bar myself are also being triggered. We are wired to imitate not only others, but we are wired to imitate the world itself. That gives us empathy. So when I look at Degas' absinthe drinker, not only do I rely on my memories of absinthe, that's one of the things you can do in France, but what that felt like and what that facial expression feels like. I'm wired for that. It's not a hard thing for me to do. Now, for art, I think the first building block has to do with play. That is to say, where we act out, where we try out, where we explore those things that we've seen is in the world of play. And most artists will tell you that when they do art, it feels like play. It has that quality of innovation, of freshness, of exploration that is associated with what play felt like when we were children. The second building block for art is our ability to engage in representation. And again, you can see how closely that is tied to our mimetic abilities, that we can see and that we can translate that and we can represent that. And I think that was highly selected for. It allowed us to draw pictures of things, to talk about hunting, to have maps of territory. There were massive selected advantages for the ability to represent. Now, the next group are basically things that neuropsychologists talk about as blendings, where different domains or different areas in the mind come together, blend together to create very, very unique neural networks. And for me, the third building block of art is the basically linking together of feeling, emotion, with pattern recognition. Now, I'm going to challenge you guys a little bit. Take a look at this painting. It is by Salvador Dali. It is known as The Slave Market or the Bust of Voltaire. Now, because of the lighting, I can't see you very well. But do you all see the bust of Voltaire? Well, in fact, let me see. Anybody not see the bust of Voltaire? You'll never raise your hands in a group this size because you'll go, what? I don't see it, but nobody's got their hands up. Okay. Well, taking a look there and see if you see this this fellow that looks like Voltaire, the French philosophe. Kind of looks like George Washington, okay? Now, if you don't see it, all right, look there. Okay, look there. See it? Yeah? Generally, when people see it, what you're going to get are these little, or these little bursts, all right? And still, for those of you that don't see it, there it is. Okay. Okay? Now, let's do one that's a little more difficult. Okay? Be brave. Somebody tell me, what's that a picture of? Hey, what? Oh, okay. Dalmatian dog. Now, for those of you that don't see that, there's a Dalmatian dog in that picture. Okay, keep looking. Keep looking. Keep looking. How about now? Oh! Now, the most important thing in all this is that oh! Okay? Not that you see the dog or not, is that oh. Dalmatian dog, sniffing the ground, all of that. Now, what all this is about is the fact that pattern recognition, seeing things, has an emotional attachment to it. That is, it feels good. In preparing for this the other day, I went back to the MoMA, to the Museum of Modern Art, and took another look at the Anselm Kiefer exhibit. And I found that as I was looking at his paintings, very abstract paintings, I would keep seeing different patterns. And I was watching my body, and it felt really good. Every time I say, oh, and they were tiny and they were little, but it was unbelievably satisfying. Well, the argument I'm making is this becomes essential for human survival. We develop these complex neural pathways between the visual cortex, between the pattern recognition centers of the brain, and between feelings. And why was that important? Because in this period I'm talking about, we were walking around the African savannas. And you know what? There were predators. And our ability to pick out predators and also to pick out food sources meant we either would survive or not. And so, boom, okay? There was a tremendous survival benefit to attaching emotions to pattern recognition. Fourth building block. The integration of hand, eye, thought, and imagination. In fact, figurative art, as we understand it today, would be virtually impossible. If I could not go from my eye to my hand, if I could not go from my imagination to my hand, I couldn't create art. And all the things that we know about art simply would be non-existent. Now, what's the evolutionary origin of that? Again, it goes back to hunting, I think. That when human beings are basically throwing, whether you're throwing a football or you're throwing a spear or a rock, once you start throwing, you can't stop. It's a very, very quick process of preparing and releasing. And so what you have to do is you have to plan ahead. And so, if I'm throwing a rock at a rabbit and, I release it just a little bit too early, it goes too far. And if I release it just a little bit too late, it falls short. So what I have to be able to do is I have to be able to plan that action based on, in most cases, an awful lot of practice. each time I'm in that situation, it is a new situation. And so what I'm bringing together is basically the ability to plan movement on one side and blending that with the ability to think about and imagine on the other to produce a unique blending in the human mind. And that's what I think most of brain evolution starts to look like, are these overlapping blendings of modules. Now we're going back to evolutionary psychology, of these modules for one area blending together with modules for another area to produce an entirely new set of skills and capabilities. Fifth building block for art. It wasn't simple. Synesthesia. Classically, synesthesia, and most of us have this ability to a minor degree. Artists apparently have it to a much greater degree, 7 times more prevalent in artists than everyday folks. Okay? Synesthesia is the ability to take information from one modality and translate it into another modality. So, for example, I listen to Beethoven's Fifth Symphony and I see, literally, see red. Or, again, using the example from the MoMA the other day, I'm looking at this vision of a desolate, snowy, bleak environment in Anselm Kiefer's painting, and I'm physically feeling cold. Most artists will tell you that they rely very heavily on synesthesia in terms of working with their art. Now, just a quick example for you. Look at those two figures, the blue figure and the green figure. Now, I'm going to show you a word, and I want you to apply that word to one of these figures. Which one do you want to apply it to? Green? You sure? Okay. And this word? The blue. Okay. Now, what you're doing is you're blending sound, kiki, boba, with figure. Now, what's interesting is across human cultures, 95 to 98% of respondents, even though they have remarkably different languages, some that don't even have sounds like kiki or boba, are able to make that blend. So again, it appears that we have a wiring for synesthesia. We even know the part of the brain, this kind of stuff goes on in something called the angular gyrus. And if people have lesions in that part of the brain, they can't do synesthesia. They can't do the blending. They see no relationship, say, between sounds on one side and images on the other. Now, even though I'm talking very specifically about figurative art, visual art, painting, sculpture, this in part becomes the basis for metaphor, for poetics, certainly becomes part of the basis for music and rhythm. We can go on and on and on. So I think many of the things I'm talking about can be translated into the other arts, though I have a much more limited location. Sixth building block for art is the propensity for exaggeration. Okay? Now, this gets very, very specific, and I think for a lot of you, it's going to kind of be an interesting, unusual way to think about art. Much of the work I'm relying on here is actually the work of V.S. Ramachandran, who's at UC San Diego. And Ramachandran was one of the first neurobiologists to become seriously interested in what were the biological foundations underlying art. And one of the things that he said is that there's this phenomena called peak shift that you find up and down the phylogenetic scale. And probably the most famous example of the use of peak shift was the work done on herring gulls. And basically, what herring gulls have is they have a red spot on their beaks. And what the little chicks will do is they will pick at that red spot. And at some point then the mother opens up and lets the little chick, she regurgitates food up and lets the little chicks eat that. Okay? Now, what ethologists, people studying animal behavior, discovered was that you could actually present chicks with something other than the mother's beak and they would peck at it. But most interesting is that you could present them with a stick that had a bunch of spots on it and they would peck at it even more than something that looked realistically like the mother's beak. And that's called the peak shift effect. Now, the argument that Ramachandran makes is that you find this in human art. We are not that interested in things that just look like what we see. That what we're interested in is things that exaggerate those things that are important to us. So from the very beginnings of human art, we find exaggeration. The other day, again, preparing for this, I walked through the Asian Art Museum, and I made a bet with my friend. I said, see if you can find one piece of art that is purely representational. Couldn't find one. All of them involve some form of exaggeration based on aesthetics, based on importance, based on formal styles. The Venus of Willendorf, about 25,000 years old, have no idea what those exaggerations mean. There's a huge literature on it. Everybody's guessing. But it's no accident that those features were exaggerated. Or, again, from a very similar period, the losange, again, an exaggeration in the form. More contemporary, this is in the Medici tomb in Florence. It's by Michelangelo. We could make a lot of jokes about whether Michelangelo really knew about women. But you look at the structure and you go, there are very conscious exaggerations that you'll see in all of Michelangelo's work. Or in the Chola bronze, Parvati, exaggeration. Or in Ange's famous picture of the woman in the harem, the elongation of the back. If you saw another human being that looked like that, you would have her go to the chiropractor really quickly. Okay? Now, it's not that Ange couldn't do it. It's that what he found interesting was this elongation. Or in Henry Moore's sculpture, even in Leonardo, we look at the Mona Lisa and but the Mona Lisa's got a funny face. And you see that in all of Leonardo's paintings. Okay? What you see is that he was using idealized facial proportions that were very important and very pleasing to him, but very different than the facial proportions that we use today. Or in Buddhist art, again, a formulary for proportion. Okay? Now, we're almost there. Seventh building block for art. Syntax in language and art. The ability to make the order of events important is critical, not only in language usage, but in the structure of how we understand the world. Without even changing the words in the sentence, just the word order, we get dramatically different meaning. The dog bit the man. The man bit the dog. Same elements, simply different word order. Well, there's the equivalence of that also in art. It's a very famous illusion in psychology called the Liar-Mueller illusion. Hopefully most of you have seen it. But the language goes like something like this. Look at the figure on the right. Look at the figure on the left. Now look at the center line. Does one line appear to be longer than the other? And the answer is yes. Which one? The one on the left. Are they exactly the same? Yes, they are. Okay? It's syntax. Exactly the same elements arranged in a different order give us an entirely different meaning. Now, I don't know, can you guys see that? I couldn't actually get in and mess with it. But if you look at that red dot in the middle, many of you will get is actually apparent motion. There's really nothing moving up there other than the end pieces, but by switching their relationship, you can even create the illusion of movement itself. And now finally, our last building block for art, complex symbolism. And I think many of us consider perhaps this the most important. Again, it goes hand in hand with the development of language and language systems. This is a Venus sculpture about 22,000 years ago. And again, its structure is a good representation of the peak shift effect. But this, from the same period, is very interesting because now what is being blended, what is being mixed together is the masculine and the feminine. And that's the masculine, by the way, for those of you that have the imagination for that. But what you find is that there's a whole array of these throughout the Dordogne. of roughly about the same period. Some more phallic, less feminine, some more feminine, less phallic. But again, that blending of very, very complex ideas of masculine and feminine, male and female. Or this, about 35,000 years ago, the blending of the lion and the human body form. So, what we have then is basically now a coming together of the ability to engage in representation, the propensity for exaggeration, synesthesia, the integration of eye, hand, and thought, play, attaching pattern recognition to emotion, syntax, and complex symbolism. You put them all together and you get art. Now, still a big problem. This is what I came up with. Remember, this is a personal journey. I'm not just, reading whatever the popular theories are. This is what I came up with. And I looked at it, and I looked at it, and I said, no, there's more to art than that. This is what Steve Pinker, who's one of the leading evolutionary psychologists, says about art. He says, look it, art is simply cheesecake for the mind. All those other things were selected for. In each case, I could talk about why they increased our adaptability to the environment. Each one of them. And so Pinker says, look it, when they come together, you've got this adaptation, and boom, out pops art. And I kept thinking, no, that's not what it feels. And this is where you go on your hunches. No, it doesn't feel like that when I look at art. And the chances of a human universal simply being this happenstance of blending is something that I'm just not at this point willing to accept. No, I'm still in process. So, finally, I turned to my own discipline. Thank God. This is what happens. You work outside your discipline. I turned to sociology. And there is a wonderful, for those of you that are interested in this as a subject, there's this wonderful woman, Ellen Dissanayake, who really pioneered the evolutionary study of art. And perhaps her most useful book for this is Homo Aestheticus. And basically she said, look it, okay, art evolved for a very specific reason, which was to make things special. In all its forms, when we use art, we use it to make things special. Whether it's an adornment of the body or the buttocks, whether it's adorning a spear thrower, 25,000 years old, or making beads that may show our social status, or even a piece of sacred red ochre. It's to set things apart, to make them special in all the different ways and reasons that we make things special. Now, again, this still doesn't take us into adaptation and natural selection, but this is the door. And basically, what the evolutionary psychologists constantly ignore, that no anthropologist or sociologist would ignore, is that by the time you get to Homo sapiens, and way before in all probability, the major adaptive mechanism for human beings was culture. And what other animals had to do physically, we did with culture. And so those things that would increase our cultural adaptabilities were probably selected for. Now, the biology of this is really scary, and the arguments, we're not going to even think about those. But the point, at least for this morning, I'm going to take is that it was what art did in human culture that is critical for our survival. And the key for me is in one of the three founding fathers of sociology, in the work of Emile Durkheim and the elementary forms of religious life. And Durkheim argued that it was ritual that held human beings together, that coming together and recreating our beliefs, our meanings, and sharing, and this is the important part, sharing emotion around those things is what holds us together, is what creates what Durkheim called social solidarity. and that the uses of this making special, the uses of art, were probably first contained in ritual. And I'll give you some interesting evidence for that. But in ritual, it was this ability to make things now sacred that helped provide social cohesion for us at a time when being closely tied together in dramatically changing and harsh circumstances had a huge evolutionary payoff. The vestiges today, the world's religions and their sacred objects, in each case, making something special. And a reminder that in most of human history, not all, but most of what we would call art is attached to what? It's attached to religion. And I think there's no accident there. In fact, people have argued that art and religion emerge roughly simultaneously. So now I want to end by returning to the caves and my quest for why was I so deeply affected. In a thesis developed by Jean Claude, who's perhaps the reigning or one of the reigning French archaeologists, and a South African, David Lewis Williams, and again studying the paintings of the caves, they came to a almost revolutionary conclusion. They came to the conclusion that the art in the caves was not about hunting, not about planning the hunt, because in fact what the folks using the caves were eating were reindeer, and you almost never see reindeer on the walls. What you see are animals that in their world would be big and powerful and important. And so they came to the conclusion that much of what you see in the caves in the south of France or in Spain are really places where shaman went to have their visions and then come back and share those visions with their people. Now, how David Lewis Williams got onto this, and again, if you want to read about his work, he's written a brilliant book, came out a couple years ago, called The Mind in the Cave. How he got onto this was in studying the rock art in South Africa. Now, we don't know the dates of that, but imagine that it's several 100 years old, not like the Paleolithic art in Europe. And the art was located in the Drakensberg Mountains of South Africa, Natal, and it was created by the Sand People. And the Sand People were the indigenous people of South Africa who were then slowly pushed, or not so slowly pushed in some cases, out of their region and finally located in a very, very small area of South Africa, the Kalahari Desert. Most of us know the San as the Bushman. That's considered a derogatory term. By the way, so is San, but that's the term everybody's using. And that what David Lewis Williams was able to do was that he was able to find anthropological records from the 19th century where this couple, a brother and sister, interviewed the San who had at one time lived in the Drakensberg Mountains and who understood and knew about the paintings, about the rock paintings. And so he was able to piece together what they said about the rock paintings with the contemporary San people who live in the Kalahari. They still today are a shamanistic people. And shamanism, trying to talk about that in 2 minutes. Shamanism is basically this idea that there is another world, an invisible world, a world of spirit, that with special practices that human beings can move into. And that this other world, this separate world, in understanding it, can have effects on human life. So, for example, the San engage in healing practices. The shaman will go into a trance and engage in a healing ceremony. They will do divinations of the future. And it's a very, very important part of their life. Their ritual, what holds them together, what gives them, in fact, solidarity in some of the most hellacious conditions that indigenous people have been exposed to. So what David Lewis Williams started to then think about was he said, okay, we have contemporary shamanistic practices, we have the historical practices, can we link them together? Well, for the contemporary Sand, the most powerful animal for them, the representation, in fact, of their god, is the eland. And the animal that you see most commonly portrayed in sand rock art is the eland. And so he began then looking at the images. And what he discovered was that, in fact, there was a pairing between human form and animal form. The eland has its legs crossed. We're not going to go into interpretations here, but just to notice, the eland has its legs crossed. The shaman has his legs crossed. The eland's hair is standing on end. The shaman's hair is standing on end. The eland's head is depicted, is referenced in the head of the shaman. So there's a story there. And that story is about a journey. So what David Lewis Williams came up with was that basically, because you see all kinds of geometric art on the cave walls, that there was a three-stage process that shaman went through. And the first was basically coming from either hallucinogens or sensory deprivation or a combination of both. These very, very vivid visual patterns that could be reproduced, by the way, in a laboratory. These patterns then were interpreted, and for the San people, most of the interpretations had to do with what they would see as swarms of bees. They would then go through a dramatic transformation, oftentimes talked about as entering the vortex, and then finally having their profound spiritual experience, more often than not having to do with a blending with one of the powerful totemic animals in their world. Now, in looking at the rock art in France, along with Jean-Claude, he found a similar pattern. This, by the way, in the cave of Lascaux, is the only depiction of a human being. It's in what's called the shaft. The painters would have had to have climbed up ropes to get to it. It's very, very inaccessible. And again, not knowing exactly how to interpret this, you have a spear thrower, you have a totemic object, you have an animal head on the person, you have an animal that's dying, that's been gutted, and again, there are endless stories. I wouldn't even begin to know how to translate those, but it does not seem like a long shot, because at least 50% of the art found in the caves was art that was pretty inaccessible. In Ruffignac, you have to go about 3/4 of a mile into the cave before you get the first art. In things like the shaft in Lascaux, you have to crawl. In fact, these places had to be excavated so that we could get in them. You had to crawl. They were inaccessible. They did not take people in there. And so what Jean-Claude and Lewis Williams surmised was that this is where the shaman would go to have their visions, and that what you saw on the walls were recordings of their visions. And this, again, is the same theory now applied to the art of the Upper Paleolithic. Again, very, very similar structures to the art of the San people. And depictions of the visions they had, the invocation of the power of the spirits. The feeling of going into these places, now completely subjective, as most of this was, but the feeling of going to these places is going into the temple of the earth. These are sacred places. And many, many people have that experience of almost like traveling. This is the entrance to what's called the axial gallery. This moving almost through a passage like the vagina of the earth itself into these mysterious places. There's evidence of drumming that went on, of musical instruments, that these were places where you probably had an interesting combination of vision and sound. Oftentimes, as you go through the caves, this is Peshmerel, which is a little bit further south of here. There'll be demonstrations of the guide will flicker a light, and the animals literally seem to come alive, like in the early motion pictures. And then the spots, the blowing of paint over the hand, you find across a huge range of rock painting from a variety of different locations and a variety of different times. So that in the end, much of this was probably very closely related to something that was very highly selected for, which was the entrance of religion, very powerful religion, very cohesive religion, into the lives of our early ancestors. Now, I want to end on a different note, slightly different note. Like most forms of human behavior that we're selected for, we very quickly transcended those forms of behavior. Me grunting, "Goat over there, let's go kill," transforms itself into the elegant poetics of Shakespeare. Okay? A life, language, a life of its own. And so too is, I think, in art. Art very quickly, and I think here in the caves, moves beyond whatever evolutionary origin or significance it had. Because I think what the shaman discovered, as many of us have discovered, is that language itself is limited. Conceptual language is limited. Talk is limited. And that the attempts to move beyond that oftentimes lead us into doing music, lead us into doing dance, lead us into doing art. And that what we're able to do in the arts is slowly approximate expressing that which cannot be expressed. And almost all people who do some form of art will talk about that, about trying to move their inner world into an outer world, not only for others to see, but for them to see. Many artists paint for themselves with no idea of ever letting other people see their paintings. They're very private. Why? Because the art is a way of seeing, for you to see what is inside yourself. And that attempt to try to express without betraying what's happening inside, I think, is fundamentally the gift of art that far moves us beyond its biology and its evolutionary history. So as I return back to the caves finally, still don't know what those damn bulls mean, okay? But what I do have a sense of now on this journey is why I respond so powerfully to them, why tears came to my eyes, why it was a moving experience. Because I have now a little bit of a sense of the journey that it took us as human beings and why, if you like, I'm rigged to respond to that. Okay, I think I'll quit there. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Congratulations. Thank you. Well, we will adjourn now for our morning break. Please return at 10:10. We'll begin the general session on the Flex program at 10:15. Thank you.